Today we come to our fourth sermon in our series and church-wide book study on Gary Moon's Apprenticeship with Jesus. What we are discovering is that the biblical notion of discipleship is more than just believing in Jesus as an intellectual assent. Discipleship really means, and we've used this language over the last few weeks, it is by the grace of the Holy Spirit assimilating to ourselves Jesus' very manner of life, letting Him, by grace, live His life in us and through us. What we've discovered over the last couple of weeks is that when we imitate Jesus, we will begin to restore the image of God within us. We'll become more and more the human beings God created us to be. And then as we talked about last week, if we live the Jesus way in a fallen world, we will seem very odd and strange and countercultural. Well, today I want us to think for a few minutes about another important component of imitating Christ. And it's optional. Jesus does not force it on us at all. We can take it or leave it. But the other component of imitating Jesus is learning how to imitate Him in His cross, His suffering in life. You know, it's interesting when you study the pages of the New Testament, in no place in the New Testament do the writers command us to imitate the Lord in His poverty, for instance. We're not commanded to imitate Jesus in His homelessness near the last few months of His life, or even in His itinerancy, moving around and preaching the gospel. None of that. But almost every page of the New Testament summons us, if we are serious about being His apprentices, summons us to imitate Jesus in His cross, His sacrificial way of life. Our gospel reading today comes from Matthew, the 7th chapter. Listen to what Jesus says. "Enter through the narrow gate. For the gate is wide and the road is easy that leads to destruction, and there are many who take it. For the gate is narrow and the road is hard that leads to life, and there are few who find it." Most people today presume that Jesus said the exact opposite of this. Most people nowadays presume Jesus said, well, broad is the way that leads to life, and almost everybody gets there. Almost all dogs go to heaven. Very few go towards the place of destruction. That's not what Jesus said. Jesus said, the road is hard. The road to life is difficult, and the gate is very narrow. Why? Because the gate of heaven is shaped like a cross. And only those who choose to assume a cross-shaped existence will be able to pass through. I mean, go back again to what we talked about last week about heaven. And one of the things that I said in my sermon is that heaven is an objective reality. It's a place, and everything in heaven is radically conformed to Jesus and the values of Jesus. Everyone in heaven has learned in this life to love the Lord's values. His values of humility, His values of mercy, forgiveness, chastity, love for the poor, the love of the will of God, the love of the praise and worship of God, all of those values. And if we really want the heaven, the only heaven that Jesus offers, then that means we have to apprentice with Him and learn how to renounce, the pride and envy and greed in us. And everyone, you cannot do that without some hardship, without some difficulty. It's hard to do. That's the cross. That's a manifestation of the cross. Our other reading today came from Paul's letter to the Philippians, one of my great favorite passages in the entire New Testament. It's in chapter 3, Listen to what Paul says. He says, I want to know Christ and the power of his resurrection. And we want to say, yes, I want to know Christ. I want to know the power of his resurrection. But listen next to what Paul says. But he wants to know, he says, I want to know the sharing of his sufferings by becoming like Christ in his death. Listen to Paul saying, I want to imitate Christ even in his death. Well, how do we imitate Christ in his death? There's only one way. We have to die to ourselves. We have to learn to die to our own will and then learn how to live in obedience to the will of God. And that's tough to do. I was thinking this week about St. Catherine of Siena, one of the great minds of the church. She lived in the Middle Ages, and she likened it to the mercenary love of Jesus versus the perfect love of Jesus. The mercenary love of Jesus, she says, this is a love for Jesus that's primarily based on self-interest. Like, I want to be a Christian so I can get to heaven, or I want to follow Jesus so that I can get the benefits of a religious experience. I mean, you just can go down the list, the peace, the joy, the consolation. That's fine, Catherine says, if you are a beginner. Nothing wrong with that if you're a beginner. But we ought to be growing and maturing in our faith. And if we're really striving to mature in our discipleship, then we should develop, Catherine says, a more perfect love of Jesus. And the perfect love of Jesus is when we get to the place when we are willing to love Christ no matter the costs, no matter the sacrifices involved. And it's when we love Jesus not for our sake, but for his sake, because he is so beautiful and good and truthful, but in complete sacrifice to our own will. That's the perfect love of Jesus. And if we want the perfect love of Jesus, if we want to try to get there and we want it, then what God will do is he will send crosses, trials, periods of difficulty that if we learn to accept them and not resist them. Most of the time when we're going through a tough time, we just resist it. But if we can learn to just relax into it, as difficult as it might be, what the grace of God is doing is conforming us more and more to Christ and his cross. That's what we are all about. I heard this analogy. I can't take credit for it. But imagine just for a moment a large block of marble, the stone. And just imagine, I can suspect this block of marble is approached by a sculptor, and then the sculptor begins to chip and to sandblast the marble. Now, in the eyes of the marble, in its own experience, what's happening to it would probably feel like a great injustice. Why is this happening? This is terrible. Because the marble has no idea what the sculptor is doing. But if the marble simply accepts what is happening, what's the end result? Well, the sculptor has created something beautiful. That's what the cross is in our lives that we have to accept voluntarily. Yes, Lord, whatever you need me to go through. That's what the trials in our life will do to us, is create something beautiful. Now, let me just say something else. None of us should seek the sufferings of this life. Suffering is not a good in and of itself. It's actually a great evil. God only directly wills the good, the blessings in our life, but God does permit these periods of difficulty and hardship. When we go through those periods of time, that's what we're talking about. Let's learn to accept them because God is trying to do something to us. We are learning now a greater sense of humility. We are learning a greater sense of our own dependence in God. We're becoming more gentle in living out of our own control. One of the great saints of the church, his name is Philip of Neri. He prayed this: I thank thee, O God, that things are not going as I should like them to. The point being is that if Jesus is really in it, there's almost always a cross in it. Here's the point. Think about love in this life. Love in this life can only be purified and perfected in the crucible of suffering and sacrifice. It's the only way love can be refined in this life, is in the crucible of sacrifice. I mean, think about a love of country. Who loves the country more? A civilian or a soldier willing to sacrifice everything for the country? And in the same way, who has learned to love Jesus more? Someone who just admires his teachings, his philosophy, or someone who is willing to sacrifice everything for the love of Christ? That's the point. Love can only be refined through sacrifice and difficulties. I was thinking over the last few days about one of the early martyrs of the church. Her name was Agnes. She's referred to today as Saint Agnes, and she lived during the 2nd century, so this is during Roman times. She was about 12 or 13 years old when she lost her life as a result of the faith. According to the story, someone outed Agnes as a Christian during a time when Christianity had been outlawed by the Roman emperor, and she had every opportunity to recant her faith. She didn't do it. And trust me, everyone, if I were 12 or 13, I would have recanted my faith. And she refused. And then a soldier took his sword and put her to death. You know, I think about Agnes at 12 or 13 years old who sacrificed everything. And I think about you and I, the church today, all the ease and convenience with which we live our Christian faith. I think we have been duped into thinking that we can go around and just have the best of both worlds. Well, I can do my own thing. I can live life on my own terms. I can have all the comforts and luxuries of this life. I can gratify my own ego no matter what. I don't really have to sacrifice anything. I can have Jesus on the side. I can worship when it's convenient for me. And I wonder what little Agnes would say to the church today. The only disciples, everyone, who remained with Jesus when he was on his cross were Mary, his mother, Mary Magdalene, a couple of other women, and the beloved disciple. All the other disciples, they fled. They abandoned Jesus when the period of trial and suffering came. They later repented. They all became martyrs themselves. But right there at the cross, the words of Jesus are coming to pass. Very few were there. I want to be a beloved disciple of Jesus. I want you to be a beloved disciple of Jesus. We should want that. But if we're going to be beloved disciples of Jesus, we have to learn to love the cross and be willing to risk the shame, the embarrassment, the difficulties of following Jesus, of apprenticing with him in this world. You know, while I'm taping this, Lent is just about 10 days away. Here's my admonition. Do something really difficult this Lent. Give something up that you really don't want to, something that's going to be hard to do. We need to feel the sacrifices we make in life. We have to feel the sacrifices we are out of the love for Christ to make for his sake and out of love for him. Do something hard. And what you will discover is that when you sacrifice something difficult for Jesus, you never lose it. Jesus only gives back to you what you sacrifice 100-fold more in this life and in the life to come.